Title: The Bone Orchard. Chapter 1: The Warden of the Wastes. The Wastes were a place of endless grey skies, grey earth, and grey lives. It was a land where the sun rarely shone, and the people lived in the shadow of the Bone Orchard, a sprawling forest of petrified trees that loomed on the horizon like the ribs of some long-dead beast. The orchard was a cursed place, said to be the resting ground of an ancient civilization that had angered the gods. No one ventured there willingly, for those who did rarely returned. Except for Kael. Kael was the Warden of the Wastes, a title passed down through generations of his family. It was his duty to protect the scattered villages from the dangers that crept out of the orchard: twisted creatures, strange plagues, and worse. He was a tall, gaunt man with eyes like flint and a voice that carried the weight of command. He wore a cloak made of woven bone, a symbol of his office, and carried a staff carved from the wood of the orchard itself. But Kael was no hero. He was a pragmatist, a man who did what was necessary to survive. And survival in the wastes was a brutal, unrelenting struggle. The villages under his protection were small and isolated, each one clinging to life like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. They relied on Kael to keep the horrors of the orchard at bay, but they also feared him. They whispered that the Warden was as much a part of the curse as the orchard itself, that his power came at a price too terrible to name. Kael didn't care about their whispers. He had a job to do, and he did it well. But even he couldn't deny that the wastes were growing darker. The creatures from the orchard were becoming bolder, their attacks more frequent. And there were other signs: strange lights in the sky, crops withering overnight, and a creeping sense of dread that seemed to seep into the very soil. One evening, as Kael patrolled the edge of the orchard, he found a girl lying in the dirt. She was no older than 16, her face pale and her clothes torn. In her hand, she clutched a shard of bone, its surface etched with strange runes. Kael knelt beside her and pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Her pulse was weak but steady. He shook her gently, and her eyes fluttered open. "Where am I?" she whispered. "The edge of the Bone Orchard," Kael replied. "What's your name?" "Lira," she said. I came from the orchard." Kael's expression hardened. "No one comes from the orchard." "I did," Lira insisted, her voice trembling. "I was sent to find you." Chapter 2: The Bargain. Kael brought Lira back to his hut, a small, sturdy structure built on the outskirts of the nearest village. He gave her water and a piece of hard bread, then sat across from her, his staff resting across his knees. "Start talking," he said. "And don't lie to me. I'll know if you do." Lira swallowed hard. "There's something in the orchard. Something alive. It's been calling to me, whispering in my dreams. It told me to find you, to bring you to it." Kael's grip tightened on his staff. "What does it want?" "It wants to make a bargain," Lira said. "It said it can give you power to protect the wastes, to drive back the creatures that plague us. But it wants something in return." "What?" Lira hesitated. "It wants a life. A willing sacrifice." Kael leaned back, his expression unreadable. "And you volunteered?" "No," Lira said quickly. "But I think it has to be me. It's been calling to me for years. I don't know why, but I feel like I'm connected to it somehow." Kael studied her for a long moment. "You're either very brave or very foolish." "Maybe both," Lira said with a weak smile. Chapter 3: The Orchard. The Bone Orchard was even more foreboding up close. The petrified trees loomed like skeletal giants, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground was littered with shards of bone that crunched underfoot. Kael led the way, his staff glowing faintly with a pale blue light. Lira followed close behind, her eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow. "Stay close," Kael said, "and don't touch anything." They walked for what felt like hours, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps. Finally, they reached a clearing at the heart of the orchard. In the center stood a massive tree, its trunk blackened and cracked. At its base was a pool of dark water, its surface perfectly still. "This is it," Lira whispered. "This is where it spoke to me." Kael stepped forward, his staff raised. "Show yourself," he demanded. The air grew colder, and the water in the pool began to ripple. A figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. "Kael," the figure said, its voice echoing like a distant thunder. "I've been waiting for you." Chapter 4: The Bargain. The figure introduced itself as the guardian of the orchard, a being bound to the land by an ancient curse. It offered Kael the power he sought, the ability to control the creatures of the wastes, to protect the villages from harm. But the price was steep. A life for a life, the guardian said. One must take the place of another. The girl has already offered herself. All that remains is your consent. Kael looked at Lira, who stood trembling but resolute. Is this what you want? He asked. Lira nodded. If it means saving the wastes, then yes. Kael's jaw tightened. He had spent his life making hard choices, but this was different. This was a life, a young, innocent life. Could he really sacrifice her for the greater good? There has to be another way, he said. The guardian's smile widened. There is always another way, but it will cost you more. Chapter 5. The Sacrifice. In the end, Kael made his choice. He offered himself in Lira's place, binding his life to the orchard. The guardian accepted, and Kael felt the power flow through him. A dark, cold energy that filled him with strength, but also with a deep, unshakable sorrow. Lira begged him to reconsider, but Kael was resolute. This is my duty, he said, and my choice. As the guardian claimed Kael's life, Lira was left alone in the orchard, the weight of his sacrifice heavy on her shoulders. She returned to the villages, carrying Kael's staff and his mantle as warden. But she could never shake the feeling that she had failed him. Epilogue. Years later, the wastes were safer than they had ever been. The creatures no longer ventured beyond the orchard, and the villages thrived. But Lira often found herself standing at the edge of the bone orchard, staring into the darkness. She could still hear Kael's voice, whispering in the wind. The cost of power is always high, he seemed to say, but it is worth it if it protects those you love. And though she never entered the orchard again, she knew that one day, her time would come. For the bargain had been made, and the orchard always collected its due.